was indicated, I'm the tour manager at the Old South, and one of the things that we have been encountering is that when we do our tours, nobody remembers who in the world is Reverend Whitfield. He's been forgotten. And so a third of our tour, we have to explain to people how important he was. And so that is going to be part of our lecture here. There are two things that you've got to understand when it comes to this presentation. The first one is we have to encounter, as many of you have, that when the general public drives down Route 1A, they see Newbury, and in the back of their mind, they're thinking, well, this is just some backwater. And oftentimes when people even come to Newburyport, enjoy the restaurants there, and they feel the history, they again, in the back of their mind, think it's a backwater. It's just no longer, anything that was significant in America was done somewhere in Philadelphia or Boston or somewhere else. It's the exact opposite. Newbury and Newburyport were very, very, very much involved in the American Revolution. We're no backwater. And so when you have your efforts to remember the first settlers and you trying to preserve the local historic district, all these things, these efforts, helps you, the American public, understand how important these have to go back. Now, the second thing about this lecture is that you have to understand and get your mind back before the Constitution of the United States. We just take for granted so much of our rights. Recently, there was a protest group that went down to Egypt. And they were going to go over to Gaza, and they were going to try to protest with the Palestinians. They never got there because they got to Egypt and they found out that they couldn't cry that their First Amendment rights were violated, and they couldn't object to the peaceful assembly because they were not allowed to assemble. And so ended up that whole thing blew up in their face because they just assumed that the Constitution of the United States is in effect around the world. It's not. It's just, as soon as you leave the border, it's behind you. So we're going back in time. So you've got to get your mind back in time to that time period. Now, they do the same thing with the Old South. They come down onto the tannery over on Federal Street, and they see that building, and they say, well, it's just another old building. It's a backwater. But actually, much of the revolution occurred, especially in Newburyport, with that. The problem was, most of the other churches were very much connected to the king. Now, when it comes to our first settlers, the Reverend Thomas Parker came from Newbury. And of course, Newbury was an inland town. There was no port. That's why Newburyport is the only town in the entire world that says Newburyport, because Newbury itself is inland. When he got his group together and they were going to go and travel to the New World, they came down to the port and got ready to jump on the ship, John and Mary. King Charles I himself came down to the port because they were going to be part of a fleet coming over, and he wanted to make sure that everybody was loyal to the king. So every settler had to swear allegiance, and that was very important because King Charles I had just got done with the trauma of Oliver Cromwell and their attempt to overthrow the kingship. So he wanted to make sure everybody was very loyal. So they got on the ship and they came over to the New World. And that first winter, 1634-35, early part, they were in Ipswich. And they were getting ready to go up to the river. I've tried to pronounce this as best I can. Kuskokwim River. And that was where they were going to do their settlement. Well, he had his congregation, but some noblemen were going to want to come along with him. One of them was Henry Becket, or Henry Sewell, I'm sorry, and Richard Dummer. Both of these were noblemen. Now again, we've got to get our minds back behind what was a nobleman. Well, a nobleman didn't have his privilege from any achievement. He was a nobleman. He was given special privilege just because of the family background. And the thing about noblemen, they didn't work. They had servants. And then they had indentured servants, which were basically a legal form of slavery. So each nobleman, when he came on to the ship with Reverend Parker and his congregation, they had a whole little contingency of people. And so when they got to Cathaquamquan and they began to do their settlement, well, Henry Sewell did not go and do it himself. He had his people go and do it. So the servants cleared the land. The servants did the fencing and began to build the buildings. And this was a real problem. And this was a problem was that down in Virginia. When John Smith was starting the Jamestown community, they ended up having a high number of noblemen. And they didn't work. And because there was only limited space on the ship, most of their servants were left behind. Next thing you know, John Smith is sitting there with a bunch of people who don't want to work. They don't want to lift a finger. They're soldiers and they're noblemen, and they're sitting around, eating and partaking in this Jamestown, and they're all starving to death because nobody wants to plow the land or do anything or build construction. He had to put a rule out saying that they could either not eat or work. And so he put that rule out, and of course they finally got involved in it, and they were able to survive the Jamestown settlement. The same situation is here now. Here comes Sewell and Mr. Dummer, and they come in with their people, and they begin to have, the rest of the families are sitting there having to do it themselves. They're having to clear the land, and they're doing all the fencing and all the cattle raising and trying to get the farm going. So there was a little bit of a resentment here with this nobleman. Now, when it came to the church service, when they had it, now you want to go on the next slide, they had, one of the problems was, in England, it was just a general practice that when you went to church, the very choicest seats right near the preacher were where the noblemen would sit. So Reverend Parker, he's naturally from Europe, he's coming in here. So the first thing they construct when they come in here are very special nobleman seats, just for those noblemen. Well, here the rest of them are slaving away while this Sewell and Dummer are doing all their management of all their servants, and there's a bit of a resentment here, especially when the people who were hard of hearing couldn't get close because here was all the good choice seats were taken up by the noblemen. And several people that John Wolcott and Peter Topham, who were prominent members in the church, constantly complained to Thomas Parker about the fact that these people were getting all the choice seats, and Parker just blew them off and just ignored it. And the resentment began to build. And so much so that finally, Caleb and Joshua Richardson and Edmund Ordway, they got together in the middle of the week, broke into the church, and smashed the smithereens with a sledgehammer all the noblemen seats. Well, Reverend Parker comes in the next day and sees the damage done here. He is furious. So he assembles the church service. They're going to discipline these people. Well, instead of hiding the fact, Richardson's and Ordway went ahead and freely admitted that they had done it. And of course, consequently, they were punished and fined for their violation of property. But when it came time for Parker said, we've got to go rebuild these nobleman seats, the church says, I think it's time we get on from there. We're not going to have any special treatment. And they quoted a scripture which was very appropriate. Here there is not Greek or Jew, circumcised or uncircumcised, barbarian, Scythian, slave-free, for Christ is all and in all. And that was in Colossians 3:11. And then another quote they did in Galatians 3:28, there is neither Jew nor Greek, there is neither slave nor free, there is no male or female. We are all one in Christ Jesus. And from that point on, that church never did annulment. And that practice began to spread around the colonies, not to have a special place for noblemen. Everyone was treated equally. This was the first spark of revolution. We became a country where everyone is not above the law, but equal under the law. Go on to the next slide. Well, for years now, let me get over here so I get it right. They had set up a system of parishes. We just assumed, say, first parish, not even thinking about the consequence of that. Basically, how a parish system would work was that if you happened to live in a particular geographic area that was set out for a parish, then you were to go to that church. Now, the reason why you went to that church, because they didn't really much care about what your religious beliefs were. They were more important about paying the pew tax. When you went into a church, you would go up and sit in the congregation. That minister up there would be preaching away. He is the tax collector. He's going to come back middle of the week and look for money from you. Now, it didn't matter if you were, they called Islamic people Mohammedans. It didn't matter if you were Islamic or if you were a drunken sailor or a rich merchant. Everybody had to be in church on Sunday because the primary purpose was to pay the pew tax. Now, a little stipend would go to the church and to the minister, but the rest of it was for the government. And then, of course, the king, he made sure that it was very much intrusive. He made sure that everybody, no matter if they were congregational or Anglican or anything, had the same prayer book authorized by the king. And because he wanted control over there, he authorized the parish system, and he also put authorization behind the ministers. So the government was very much in control. And of course, we all know about the King James Version of the Bible. Everything was to be the same. Trying to get some kind of control inside. And so the government and the church were one. That's why if you go down Farrell Street and you look up at the Old South, you'll say meeting house. And this was a very common term. You see it in perhaps most every New England, you'll see the church will have, say, meeting house, because half the time it was the town hall along with the church. So this parish system was set up just for that purpose. Now comes along Reverend Whitfield. Now he was an itinerant minister. He was going from town to town, church to church, and he was preaching the message about ye must be born again, John chapter 3. And he wanted to go ahead and preach to these people that you must have eternal life through being born again. So he would come into a town and he would sit in that congregation filled with people of all different persuasions, and he would preach that gospel, and then a small group would indeed become born again. And then he, as an itinerant minister, would get up and leave and go on to the next place. When it came to Newburyport, he comes into town and he is famous. Now, everybody who gets off a ship from London knew all about Whitfield. He was connected with the royal family. He was an Anglican minister. He was well connected with every level of society in England. And the word about him was striking because he, unlike many ministers who just sit there and read the sermon rather boringly, or they would have a very serious homily, he was just like a Billy Graham of his day. In fact, Billy Graham modeled his own ministry after Whitfield. Powerful preaching, and it was being filtered over to America. So he comes in, Reverend Lowell is the pastor at the third parish, here in Newburyport. And so he says, hey, let's go to the preacher, come on in to a church. And at that time, we had 850 people attending there. And Whitfield gets up and preaches, he must be born again. And according to the Newburyport Public Library, that very day, 143 out of that church came to Christ. Then he goes on to the first parish. Reverend Hobbins, Christopher Hobbins was the minister. And he, of course, he's a famous one preacher. Come on into the church. 350 people, country church, of course, first parish. And according to the public library, that very day, 64 people came to Christ. And what does Whitfield do? He disappears. Just like that. Now you've got these people who now they call them new lights. And then you had the rest of the people, and they were Puritans. Now, H.L. Mencken has a famous quote. He says, a Puritan is a person that suspects that someone, somewhere, is being happy. One of the things I got worried about when we had our new pastor from Oklahoma come and take over the Old South was over in Old South, he used to say, hello, neighbor, and then our neighbor will, hello there, neighbor, and so they're just happy-go-lucky. That's not the way it is in New England. That's because we still have that Puritan flavor. You know, I say, hello, somebody down in Newburyport, and they go, like that. And she's a common way it is up here. So, that kind of attitude was prevalent in the church. In fact, they had been so paranoid, they elevated Satan so that he was under every rock, around every corner. And Bethany Goff has this funny presentation she does sometimes when she does the Ilsley Inn, talking about these people who they would accuse Satan has done something, because of that, because of Satan, everywhere. They were paranoid, they were depressed, and all of a sudden you got these new lights who are trying to follow the scriptures, and are they crazy? No, they're happy. How dare they be happy? And so the rest of the Puritans were all upset. And so they began to attack these new lights. And the ones that were attacking were called the old lights. And it caused quite a division there in Newburyport. And so it got to be so much so that they would harass these new lights. Now, Reverend Lowell himself was getting very upset because of all this division going on. And some of these new lights were so enthused about it, they wanted to turn the third parish into a Presbyterian church. And he didn't care for that too much. And so he got a little angry at them. And then Reverend Toppins over at the first parish has a reputation of being a bit, let's just say, a very nasty temper. And he got so upset at these new lights that he put a whip on his belt. And every time he encountered some of these new lights, he curbed their enthusiasm because they kept calling them enthusiasts. Now, we think of enthusiastic, that's happy. Well, no, that's somebody who, back in those days, the definition of enthusiast was a cultist, like Jim Jones, a heretic. They began to accuse these new lights, and they literally drove them out of these two churches, First and Third. And they went over and met initially over in Joppa, but then they ended up putting a small log cabin up there. They were outside the parish system now. They're supposed to be paying their tax. And so these First and Third parish began to attack them for not paying their parish tax. And they protested and said, well, we'll pay our tax. They ended up forcing them for a long time, paying double tax. So it got to be quite nasty in there. Well, 3 years later, Whitfield comes back, and he sees this great division. Well, Papa's going to let him on his property, And Lowell was very upset and just said, oh no, you're not coming in here. And so he saw this little log cabin chapel up on High Street, and he went up there to preach. After he was done preaching there, the people there asked him, what kind of a church should we have? And he told them, I want you to be a Presbyterian church to secure your liberties. He said, hey, look at this, sir. What's he doing? Well, he was very angry at the fact that the government was one with the church. He felt very much that the church should be separate, doing what God wants them to do, and not the government. And here was an opportunity for them to be away from this parish system where the government had absolute control. So every time he would encounter one of these new congregations all across from Georgia to Maine, he would make them into Presbyterian. Now, many of them became Baptists, Methodists, Separatists, brethren, and he constantly complained about his chickens turning into ducks, I'm sorry. And so but after 30 years, he transformed America into no longer following after the government, and more importantly, no longer following after the king. So this is a transformational thing. Now, every one of those other pastors in Newburyport and Newbury, we're committed to the king, loyal. We're assigned by the king. Here's a minister over here at Old South who's not been assigned by the king. That's a big division. And so it began to be all across. And they say that Whitefield was actually an inventor of a thing called an American. We just assume that the government does not interfere with our churches. There's nobody out there on the front yard of the whole community church saying, okay, you got to do this in the pulpit, you got to say this. There's no regulation. It's just the way it is. It doesn't matter if it's a mosque or a Buddhist temple. We just assume the government stays out of religious activity. Whitefield was the one who transformed the country like that. Now, with that tremendous influence, here's Reverend Lowell, all right. Here's a good picture of him. Maybe you know about this. Put that over there. You can see Reverend Lowell's picture. Next one. All right, well, go before that. I'll have to show it to you. Reverend Lowell. And here was the third parish down at Market Square initially. And that's where it was. Let's get there. All right, and now, so here's a situation where we have these separate people, and there's one group that was not following the rules of the parish system, the government-controlled system, and they were separate, and that was the Old South. Now, here comes the next situation, the Christian smugglers. Now, this was a very complicated thing here. You see, the colonies were supposed to be part of the British Empire. You're supposed to send all your goods over to the mother country and sell them. Well, the trouble was, England was just exploding with the Industrial Revolution. They had all these factories, and all of a sudden they were being invaded with cheap American goods. And so they're supposed to be selling their goods in America to England, but just like you think about tariffs being the new thing that you hear about in the news, England put a tariff on American goods. Now, how's the Americans supposed to make any money? And so they were very frustrated. And so they ended up doing a system that we even do today. In fact, you've got to censor your law to find attending here. But you're going to leave here. You're going to get on Route 95. You're going to get on 495 or any other superhighway. And you're going to be driving down and you're going to look right at the sign that says 55 miles an hour or 65 miles an hour. How many go 65 miles? You're barreling along at 75, and worse, the police aren't even stopping you. You're barreling along at 75, 80 miles, and everybody's doing the same thing, violating the law. It's right. And in fact, if somebody tries to go in 55 or 50 and they slow down enough, the police will stop them and chastise them for not following along with the rest of the crowd. Well, that was the situation now for the new colonists. They didn't have any money. They couldn't sell their goods in England, so they, not supposed to, they sold their goods to the enemies of England. The Spanish, the French, the Dutch, and they began to make lots of money. Now, they called the Navigation Acts, rather spiritually in England, the negligent acts, because now we have all these Americans with lots of money in their hands coming over and buying British goods. It was a pretty good setup, too. And then what they would do in America is they'd have all these customs officials in each of the ports, and the Americans would pay them off, bribe them. And oftentimes they would get their little share of bribery. And a ship would come in, unload at a port. Not what the American Yacht Club is today. It is what used to be Cooms's wharf. And he was a privateer for a while there, but he was also a smuggler. And so they would come into Coom's wharf, unload about a third of the cargo, and then they would adjust the manifest, and then they would go on to the bottom of Green Street where the customs agent was, and said, well, this is all we got. And this is the way it was constantly. Well, in comes the French and Indian War. Now, Britain, hurrah, they won the war against the French. But now they've got this huge advancement in America, and they're broke from fighting this costly war. So they figured, hey, we protected the British colonists, we will then tax them. So they ended up doing the infamous Stamp Act. Anything that was going on that was sold and bought had to have a Stamp Act. Well, the people were absolutely furious in America, and they began to riot, and they began to protest hugely to the British government. They never didn't expect such a blowback. In fact, it got so bad that there was almost like a revolution at that time period. But Ben Franklin and his good friend, Reverend Whitfield, went by ship over to Parliament and persuaded Parliament to repeal the tax. And they did. Now, after they were done doing it, everybody over in America was celebrating, but they didn't repeal one Stamp Act, which was on tea. Now, I don't know if they knew it or they didn't know it, but King George had a special share in that company, the British East India Tea Company, and so they didn't repeal it there. So now the Americans are having a special focus of ire against them. Well, so they began to enforce. Now, another thing that they did was the Townshend Act. The Townshend Act came in and said that now, because we have all these corrupt customs agents, we're going to bring the soldiers in, and they're going to enforce the customs. Well, the people of Newburyport were furious. This is how they made their money. And now we end up having somebody come in there and take over and enforce it. Now, when they brought those soldiers in, they put them in all the port cities. Those soldiers didn't go to barracks. According to the Townshend Act, you're sitting there at your family's table, you're having your dinner, and all of a sudden you hear a knock on the door. And you open it up, and there's a British soldier there. And he says, I'm coming in. I'm living at your house. Not only that, because you didn't have any rights of protest, you had to provide them lodging and food. Here it is, you're trying to raise for your family, and now you've got a soldier you've got extra to feed. This caused tremendous tension throughout the colonies. Here are these soldiers of America, and now they're all around you, and they're imposing on your rights. So they had one thing where the customs was enforced, and a captain, let's see, I think it was Captain John Emery, was up in Portsmouth, and he was arrested for smuggling. And the whole town in Newburyport was furious. They found out that 2 informants had gone, Joshua Vickery and this Francis Mango, a Frenchman, had come in and informed and squealed on this. They said, well, not just a mob, the entire community was in uproar. And they grabbed Joshua Vickery, who was a ship's carpenter, and they grabbed Francis Mango, and they took them up onto High Street, which at that time was called the King's Highway, and they tarred and feathered Francis Mango. Now, Joshua Vickery was a fast talker, and he finally convinced them that he was innocent, but Francis Mango, the poor man, was tarred and feathered. And then shortly thereafter, after he was in prison, he fled town. People were not going to put up with it because the entire town of Newburyport was guilty of smuggling. And so they had no tolerance for this. Now, this already caused quite a problem here. Go to the next slide. Here was another issue where there were no rights, no way to protest. Now, there was a man, Reverend John Murray, and he was up in Booth Bay Harbor, Maine, and his parishioners encountered a terrible problem. When the naval ships came in, the officers got off, and they looked around, and they would look, and some guy would come out of his house, and he's going down to the local convenience store to buy some eggs, milk, and bread, and next thing you know, he's grabbed by the officers, thrown onto the ship. He's now somewhere halfway on the other side of the planet, and worse, because he'd been pressed, that's the term they used, he wasn't paid for 6 months to up to 2 years so he wouldn't flee the ship. Well, John Murray, Reverend Murray, was furious. And he got on a ship, on a small boat, and he went over to the naval ship, the frigate, and he convinced the captain with great intimidation to let his people go. And the captain was so intimidated, he let them go. And so they all came back and they all celebrated. But he wasn't supposed to be doing that. So next time they came around, and the ship was in town, the officers came out to look, and they couldn't find a single able-bodied man. Mary had hidden them all. Well, they knew right away who was guilty, so they put a 500-pound bounty on his head. And then they brought in 2 frigates that were going to hang him as an example to everyone else who objected to pressing. Well, for years, he had been an itinerant minister too, partially. And so people knew about him at the Old South. So the Old South militia heard about this terrible problem, and so they brought their militia and went by land all the way up, and they grabbed him just in time before he could get seized. And they brought him down to Newburyport. Well, Parsons was still the minister there, so he continued on down to Boston, and he became the president of the Provincial Continental Congress, right there rubbing shoulders with Paul Revere and Samuel Adams and John Adams. So he was down there. Now, the situation got even worse. We'll get down over here. Now remember, people are angry about these soldiers being housed in people's homes. And so they had the Boston Massacre. And this thing really deeply affected people. Now, Henry Pelham was a local Newburyport publisher. He created this wonderful engraving here, and he began to publish it out. Well, Paul Revere saw that engraving, translated it into a silver plate, and next thing you know, it was on newspapers all across the colonies. So we ended up originating in Newburyport this wonderful diagram that everybody saw. At the same time, of course, there was the Tea Party that was occurring. Now, the king was furious because he had potential share in this British East India Tea Company, and he was furious over this fact. And so he was angry very much that he had losing all this revenue. Excuse me. So, Parsons at Old South was very much known for preaching against the government control of the church. So he ended up creating a pamphlet called The Freedom from Civil and Ecclesiastical. Here, go on a little bit further. All right, here's Pastor Parsons. He was trained at the New Jersey College, and that later became Princeton University. And he was also a Great Awakening minister, just like Reverend Whitfield. In fact, he was originally from Lyme, Connecticut, and he had the nerve to preach the gospel at the church that he was at, and he got fired. And so Whitfield recommended he come over and take over the pastorship at Old South, and he did so. But he was a fierce patriot. And he wrote this pamphlet called Freedom from Civil and Ecclesiastical Slavery. Now, it's sort of been lost out in the history, but there was a couple governors in Massachusetts that came in, wanted to put the churches under the king's authority directly, just like an Anglican church. And there was a lot of pushback on that. So these governors ended up getting deposed and sent back packing to England. But there was this constant pressure to have the government have absolute control of the church. And so he did this flyer, sent it all across from Georgia to Maine, and he was significant in influence. Now we think of the Thomas Paine, common sense, it was the same thing. Sent out the flyer all across to charge up the colonists and realize that they're end up going to lose their liberties. Now, Whitfield, who had been back and forth from England to America, knew how bad things were. And he knew the sentiment that was going on in England. So he says the following: "Oh, poor New England, there is a deep-laid plot against your civil and religious liberties, and they will be lost. Your golden days are at an end. Your liberties will be lost." And they began to tell the people, you might as well enjoy it now because you're going to lose it very much soon. Go back. There we go, up to the Labrador Tea. Well, Jonathan Parsons was purely furious. Well, we had an action here. Now, the only thing that we had a Stamp Act still on was the tea. So Jonathan Parsons came up with an idea. He gathered all the women at the Old South, and they had a massive tea party at his house. You want to go down a little bit further? Beyond, go back. There we go. This is the house where the tea party was held. It's right there on School Street, right behind the Old South. And that is the manse or the parsonage. And he had all the women organized to have a tea party in which they were going to boycott the British tea. Now, the Indians had a type of tea called Labrador tea. And they used this tea. It was very medicinal, very beneficial to you. Got a few side effects, which is hard. I had to go, we did a tour a couple months ago, and I had difficulty getting it here because it's sort of discouraged being used here in America. It has a few weird side effects. Too long. But he spread it. That was going to be their new tea. And then he sent the word all the way from Georgia to Maine. And so all these people were boycotting the king's tea that he was trying to make some money from. And he wasn't too happy about that. Now go a little bit further. Now, at the same time that this tea was now representing the tyranny of England, we had Eleazar Johnson. Now, he was just a shipwright. He had no special position, but he was down, his shipyard was at the bottom of Borden Street. If you know Merrimack Street, along the Newburyport, along the water there, Borden Street is insignificant street there, but right across was a shipyard for him. And he wanted to protest this tea that was causing a symbol of the tyranny of England. So he convinced all the rest of them. So they grabbed their adzes. They didn't have, this is an adze. And they grabbed their adzes and they went out and they, according to, this is the family tradition. We've had some trouble. The Governor's Academy did a study, and so they don't have anything confirming it, but the family tradition was that they got together with the shipwrights and they went out into the harbor, boarded a London ship that had all the tea, grabbed it, seized it, brought it over to Borden Street, the bottom, and burned it. Well, the town of Newbury was pretty upset. This is not authorized. These are mob. And so they didn't get some patriotic reward for what they did. And so, but later on, Eleazar Johnson ended up owning that same shipyard we worked at. His father passed away, and he ended up owning it. Now he had good standing, and later on, in April of 1775, we have this as well documented, thanks to the Governor's Academy, their research. He then brought the tea that was being stored by the town at the powder mill that was up at Portland now. And so he organized the same. Now this time, you had to be careful because it's the powder mill. That's where all the tea was being stored. So they ended up, he said, knock off all your heads here. We're going to take our handles here. We're going to go down and we're going to break open and get that tea and burn it. And sure enough, they went up there, and according to that, Nathaniel Tracy was supposed to guard the powder mill. He knocked him off to the side. They used these handles and barged them and grabbed the tea and dragged it down to Market Square, where they burned it quite publicly. And so that is well documented. Well, the fever pitch is now very high in the colonies. And so now we had a problem. We had a lot of people still wanted to be loyal to the king. And so they said, there's got to be an opportunity here. So they adopted this flag, which is, just saying, hey, we're still loyal. We are the 13 colonies, but we will have you as our king. And so they sent a petition. And they said, we've got our last chance. And so in November of 1774, they sent it out. Move on to the next one here. There's the petition done by the Continental Congress in Philadelphia, hoping that the king would be able to keep the parliament under control. It was creating all these terrible acts that were oppressing them. Well, remember, who was benefiting from the tea? Well, the king is furious. He's lost revenue, and now he has this rebellion on his hand, and so the next one is the proclamation for suppressing rebellion and sedition. He basically told them, you're all rebels, you're all worthy of hanging, and so you are now enemies of the English Empire. So now they had lost their opportunity to be able to get amends with him. So let me get on here. All right. So lo and behold, tempers were now high and there was no stopping it. So this happened next. The Battle of Lexington conquered. Now, because of the logistics of Newbury and Newburyport, we ended up gathering all our militia. And each militia was focused around the churches. There was a militia for St. Paul's, militia for the Third Parish, and a militia for the South, and then also for the First Parish. And they all gathered together as one and went down to march. Now, because of the logistical purposes, most of the Battle of Lexington conquered had occurred already. And so when they got there, the British forces were retreating, and Colonel Leslie had sent flanking movements across the road so that they were in great danger as from being outflanked by British soldiers, but most of the battle occurred beyond them. A few of them fought at the Battle of Menominee, which is Arlington, and then most of them ended up in Danvers. So when the battle was all over with, All the militia from Newburyport came back as whole. Now, Parsons is a patriot. He has had it. So he gets up and he has a fiery sermon at the Old South. And I saw in your lobby there a little posting of Ezra Lunt and the 55 volunteers that came forward from that preaching. And so they came together and they were going to get ready to go and fight down at Boston. Now, you don't just gather together when you come and you volunteer. You have to get your own uniform. You have to come together, go down to the shop and make sure your guns are in proper order. You have to accumulate all your ammunition. Plus, the 55 volunteers have to now train themselves. So even though Parsons had challenged them in April, they didn't get there until it was time, almost right in the middle of the Battle of Bunker Hill. Now, let me explain something about this battle. I'm glad it's in this large screen so you can clearly see. Now, General Howe was a brilliant tactician. He recognized right away that all he had to do was bring a ship up, right where that arrow is up there, and cut off the rebels. And they would, instead of having this great battle of Bunker Hill, there would have been a whole bunch of POWs in a camp. But the other generals persuaded him that no, all we got to do is have them land at Mullins Beach there and line up, and those rebels will take one look at that and just turn around and flee. And so he was outvoted. So sure enough, they landed at Mullins Beach. They kept marching up, and as we know from history, they had 2 attacks in which a lot of their soldiers died. Trying to get to this earthworks that was up there. Finally, they ended up, instead of lining up like this, they pile drive up and finally attacked the rebels, and the rebels began to flee. Now, General Howe was impressed. Instead of throwing their muskets down and fleeing like a bunch of chickens, they very organized came and began to retreat in a very, very disciplined way. Now he knew it was big danger here, because if they got off the peninsula, then he would have to fight them again. So he brought his ship like he originally wanted to and brought it up there. Just at that moment, Ezra Lunt and his militia showed up. As the people, the rebels, were trying to retreat off this peninsula. So he was given the instruction to hold off the British until they could get all the people off the peninsula. So, according to the soldiers' accounts, they lined up single file, they said like Indians, went along this fence line that was up at Charleston's Neck where the arrow is, and then they went over to a farmer's barn, grabbed all the hay they could, and piled it up against the fences and waited for the British. And sure enough, General Howe brought the ship in, and they unloaded onto the Marines on these longboats to try to attack Port Ezra, greenhorn, never been in a battle before. Next thing you know, disciplined Marines from that ship were now beginning to attack them. And they were able to have withering fire to the point where they could not land. And so they were able to repel them. They said, repelled them for several times. Finally, they got frustrated on the British ship, and so they brought the Marines back, loaded up on, and then they put direct cannon fire right onto Ezra and his group until they finally had to drag them off. Now, according to records, only 2 people died from his company. One was captured by the British, but by that time, most of the rebels had retreated off. And so that when General Washington showed up, he actually had an army to think. So Ezra Lunt and his militia, Old South, and their militia saved the Continental Army. It's pretty significant. Go on to the next one. So now they had the rebels surrounding Boston, and they were trapped. The trouble was, there was no really any cannon or gunpowder that they had. So as we well know from history, General Knox grabbed cannon from Fort Ticonderoga and dragged it over. But what the British didn't know, fortunately, was they didn't have any gunpowder either, or cannon, or muskets. And so William Coombs, from his privateer dock, right down here at American Yacht Club, what's underneath them, he brought 2 ships down to Guadalupe in the Caribbean, loaded up the entire ships with gunpowder, musket balls, cannonballs, and he brought it all back up. And then he donated both ships, no charge, to General Washington. Now they had something to go inside General Knox's cannons, and the gig was basically they were in trouble there in Boston. But the British were getting frustrated, and so they began to have a problem. Let's see if I can get over here. Next slide. I think we'll go back. We'll go back. Okay. So they began to go and attack around the ports up and down the Atlantic coast. The first place they hit was Falmouth, which is modern-day Portland. They burned the entire town completely down. Then the British went down to Norfolk, Virginia, tried to burn it down completely. Then they were coming up to Marblehead, up in the peninsula there, and began to attempt to burn it down also. The constant attack of here. So if you go a little bit further, I think we'll go a little further. A little further. There we go. So we had a problem. Newburyport was right there with this William Coombs, the same guy who brought 2 ships down. He goes and he gets a crib, which is basically a wooden structure that could float, and then would bring it down to a certain point in the mouth of the river, and then they would fill it up with rocks just below the water until it was such. So now, the only way to get into that port was to have a pilot who knew exactly where those cribs were. And sure enough, the British tried to get into the fort, but they could not do it, and because of those hidden cribs. Now, George Washington finds out that Newburyport uniquely is protected from being burned down. And so he ends up sending a letter, which, by the way, recently they found it underneath City Hall, an old record. George Washington sent a letter thanking the city of Newburyport, or the town of Newburyport, shall I say, and that they were now safe to be a privateer center. So the privateers went out. Nathaniel Tracy had hundreds of these privateers sent out. And Mark Juan was another gentleman who put out many of them. Coombs. Well, we think of Newburyport being away from the war. According to the Courier, if you look in the historical records, they estimate as much as 1,200 natives. And of course, many of them came from Georgetown and Topsfield and Danvers and Raleigh and so. But 1,200 lost their lives trying to cut off the supply routes from England to Boston. The situation got to be quite rough. So, but there it is, the Battle of Boston. They were sitting around. Now, while this battle was going on, I want to back up a little bit more. There we go. Colonel Arnold, Benedict Arnold, had proposed to George Washington that since he was familiar with the city of Quebec City up there, up in Canada, that he thought that we'd be able to do it. So they lined up down around the Arlington area to volunteer. And Ezra Lunt and his militia, that had only been battle tested, decided to join them. In the same time, Reverend Spring, a fierce patriot of them, became the chaplain of this group. And their job was, they were going to come up, go to Newburyport, and then they were going to get on Newburyport ships and then head on up. And so we ended up having, I don't know this before. Oh, there we are. Okay. So they did. They came up here to Newburyport. Well, because so many of his volunteers were from Newburyport, Colonel Arnold sort of let go of the discipline a little bit, and he went in, he stayed, he slept overnight at Nathaniel Tracy's mansion, which is the public library, and then they partied all across the town, and all these militia who were already well connected with Newburyport and Newbury went back to their homes and it was just a big party, basically, for several days. And then they finally got together and they got down to the waterfront and then we got ready to go. But just before that, now we went, Reverend Spring, now the chaplain, got to the Old South and they had a special dedication, which we will be honoring, as you saw that pamphlet there. That's going to be going on September 21st. We're going to have a special dedication on Saturday at 11 o'clock. We're going to be reenacting the entire service. Now, this was famous because they had the soldiers come in with flags, and they had drummers coming in, and then the whole purpose was to dedicate these soldiers for the battle, not really for the public that was surrounding them. And so they came in, and the first one was marched down was Reverend Spring, then came Colonel Arnold, and then came Captain Morgan. And they came down and paraded, and then they had this wonderful dedication sermon by Reverend Spring. Now, anybody at the Central Congregational Church will grow about the fact that they were so impressed with his preaching that they wanted him to abandon the military right there and become their new pastor. He was that impressive in his speech. And so, well, he said, well, I've got my commitments. I've got to go. And so, but later on, when it had the battle and then he came back, he did indeed become the pastor of the Central Congregational, at that time it was the North Congregational Church, and became the pastor. He was quite a patriot. It was good that he had continued with the military, because when they went up in attack, Colonel Arnold got seriously wounded, and Reverend Spring dragged him out of battle and saved his life by getting him to the hospital right away. So he was an important position he had. So what's so big about the Quebec expedition? Well, the fact is, most everything that was going on in the Revolutionary War was going on outside Newburyport. Them coming to the town, having that dedication, and then going and getting on those Newburyport ships was the first, really the most important direct involvement of Newbury and Newburyport with the American Revolution. We were right in there with it. Now, later on, go on from here, there, off. Now, here it is, July 19th of 1776. The Declaration of Independence arrives here in Newburyport. Now, the reason why it's so very much important is that Captain Michael Hodge got up on the second floor of the third parish and read that declaration to whole townspeople. And they were all excited. They got together rejoicing and celebration. Unfortunately, on that very day, Parsons, the great patriot Parsons at Old South, died the very day. And so they ended up, in return, asking for Murray, John Murray, who they had rescued, to become the new pastor. And he accepted, and he came up here and departed as president from the French Continental Congress. So they were mourning at the same time. Now, when Murray came up, right away, he ended up challenging again the Old South congregation, and they ended up coming. If you go back again, there we go. This is from the photograph from the 1975 reenactment of the gathering of Ezra Lutton and his gathering. But this, he did again challenge the people, Reverend Murray, and they ended up having quite a few people from the congregation end up joining the Continental Army. And Reverend Parsons' son became a general in the Army and was on Washington's personal staff. So we had very much involvement there. And that later became the Yankee Division, which anybody who goes down to the armory that's on Low Street, anybody who participates there gets a special ribbon because they were much involved in being the first division of the U.S. Army. And so it was quite significant. You get a special ribbon down there for being part of that militia, of that National Guard unit. Go on to the next one. Now, after all that, years later, General Washington returns. He comes back here because he knows about how important Newbury and Newburyport were to the war. In fact, he comes up here not to parade and get recognition and all this stuff. He comes out to thank the shareholders of his party. The Federalist Party, which was very strong in Newburyport, Newbury, Rowley, and Ipswich. He came up here to thank them and to report to them as a supporter of that party. In addition, he also came up to Newburyport to thank especially the city for participating in privateering, which enabled the Battle of Boston to be victorious. And then he also came with a special letter that he sent to the Old South, and met with the Presbyterian of the South, Old South, because they had been so much involved in the Revolution that he had a special recognition for them. And he also recognized also how important this town was. Newbury, Newburyport, and Ipswich created the Essex Resolve. Now later on, when they were doing the Constitution of the United States, one of the principles of the Essex Resolve was inspired by Theophilus Parsons, who was also in Newbury, very much involved in Newbury, in Byfield area. And he had a law office there on Federal Street. And he and the people of those two towns created the Essex Resolve, which caused a division that's to be recognized in the Constitution between the separate powers of the legislative, the executive, and judicial. All you hear on the news, current events, is the constant battle between the legislative, executive, and legislative. That was all instituted by the people of Newburyport and Ipswich. Another thing, Parsons was a big advocate of the Bill of Rights that we now get to enjoy and which unfortunately we oftentimes take for granted. He was responsible for the Ten Commandments. When James Madison had written this baby of his, U.S. Constitution, he argued that there was no need for the Bill of Rights, but there was so much pressure on him that he took many of those principles of the Bill of Rights and instituted them into the Constitution. John Adams, who did our Massachusetts, made sure those Bill of Rights were put on the front part of the Constitution, and we get to enjoy the privileges that we have. We don't have to worry about pressing. We don't have to worry about freedom of speech. We don't have to worry about the government interfering in our religious affairs. All these wonderful things, and it came from this area. And so we go on to the last picture. They wanted to return that kind of gratitude by having this huge float that they put on the Merrimack River. And they put George Washington on there as like an emperor, you know, and crossed him over into Salisbury when he went onto New Hampshire and Maine. So this is the kind of thing that we have as an involvement here. This is why we celebrate. Let me get over here. This is why we celebrate how much involvement we have. So when we think again, Newbury and Newburyport are not a backwater. We're very much involved in the Revolution and also in the Constitution that we fought for so much our predecessors for. And so we're important, and we get to enjoy that, and it's a privilege of that. And I just want you to take away from that how much was done here and not some faraway place. That is my presentation.
Will you take questions?
Oh, questions, okay. We'll do questions, okay. All right.
Hi, sorry. You had said, and I heard in an earlier talk, that there was this attack by individuals from Newbury or Newburyport on the town's armory. I guess it was the armory.
Powder mill.
The powder mill. The powder mill where the tea was stored. Why was the tea being stored there? And where did that tea come from that they then tried to take, or did take out to burn in Market Square?
The tea was being sold at different stores, basically in Newburyport, and also was on several of the port ships. And there was so much anger focused on that tea that the town felt that the only safe way to do it was to gather all the tea, and they came in these brick forms, and they gathered them up and put them in the powder house. They were going to have a large town committee, and they were going to try to determine what they wanted to do with all this tea. And so they were very angry that Eleazar Johnson and his crowd intercepted them and ended up taking it away. They felt it was a black mark against their city because it had been such a responsibility for them. So we didn't get all the wonderful honor like they did down in Boston because they felt like he was just doing mob rule. Yeah.
Are the cribs still in the hopper there, or are they removed?
Oh, they removed them, obviously. We, back when they were digging up they actually were trying to expand the sewer department in Newburyport, and when they were doing so, they ended up stumbling upon Coombs Wharf. And when they went down, they found out the way William Coombs had created the wharf was to do the same thing with the cribs. They positioned them in, and they filled them up with rocks until they sunk, and so the whole dock was done with cribbing, which was a very common practice back then. Yeah.
Were the tunnels that used to, I don't actually know if there were tunnels, I think there were they used for any of these purposes that you're talking about here?
Are we talking about smuggler tunnels?
Yeah.
I'll be doing a large talk on custom houses like that. The trouble with being a smuggler, you're not supposed to advertise your smuggling. And so, sure enough, there are smuggling tunnels underneath Newburyport. There's a gentleman down in Salem who does tours, and they found out they had over 3 miles worth of tunnels underneath Salem, Massachusetts. Now, what they did down there was each smuggler had his own individual tunnel. Now, according to legend, this is legend, that our tunnels were all unified. And because they were smuggler tunnels, they were not down the main street, they were down through the side alleys behind people's homes. And then the tunnel would come up to individual homes. The gentleman down in Salem, he wants to do a big tour about these stuff, and all the homeowners say, "Oh, no, you don't." Because the tunnels go directly up into people's basements. The same thing is happening here in Newburyport. We know where the tunnels are, we know where their position is, but according to legend, all tunnels come together, they go underneath High Street, and they end up at the Oak Hill Cemetery. Now, for the longest time, people thought, well, that was just a made-up legend, because the Oak Hill Cemetery was established in 1842. But there was a cemetery before that called Maid Hill Cemetery. And it was present when they had this tunnel. And sure enough, you go there, here's the cemetery, and these people were very God-fearing. They didn't go put tunnels inside the cemetery. They put them on the outside. And then they ended up going to a very, very steep hill where they had an entrance there. And then they would unload all these goods from the docks down onto there, and then they would go over to either down Route 1A, or they would go down Route 1, whatever was there before. And so that was how they distributed the smuggled goods. Those smuggling tunnels were done during Thomas Jefferson's term. Now we know why, because he had basically boycotted British goods, and Newburyport was going broke. We couldn't ship out, we couldn't come in, and so they ended up, the only way they could survive was by smuggling. And so they brought in all these goods, and the way the tunnel's set up, it's like a half moon, like this, and then the barrels, which was their UPS cargo boxes, had a metal ring around the middle. They would roll them up through the tunnel. That's how they would do it. And so you'll see pictures of long lines of these barrels on their side, and that's how they would transport them up. Now, Glee Woodworth is on the board for the Oak Hill Cemetery, and she would wring my neck if I tried to open up those tunnels. But I know where the entrance is, and so I'm just like, I wish I could get in there. It's like $1,000 fine if you try to disturb the cemetery's grounds, and I know exactly where it comes out and where it goes out. So that's another lecture we'll be doing in Epicenter. That's more than you probably think, but that's where there really is indeed smuggler tunnels underneath the city of Newburyport.
I had a question on the same subject. My sister-in-law owned a house on the other side of Route 1 in Newburyport. I can't remember the name, it was a long time ago. And in her cellar was bricked in. And it faced the water. It was far from the water. And I was just wondering if that was for contraband or slavery or both.
Well, so when it comes to the slavery issue, Underground Railroad and stuff, most of Newburyport was hostile toward the abolitionists. They were terrified that the Southerners would boycott their rum, for their molasses, shall we say, for their rum, and they would boycott the cotton for their textile factories. And so they were very much against the abolitionists. So the problem was, there's been no recorded evidence, anything in the public library about slaves being smuggled underneath the tunnel. Now, contradicting that, William Bartlett was a very pro-abolitionist merchant, and there were several times when they had caught slaves being smuggled at his dock down there. And there is a tunnel that runs from there to his house. So we don't know. But the most records show that they would not normally go through. They would just hide them through carts or put them on hay bales and then run them out into the country. And there's a well-documented case where one wagon went from Pascagoula, Parker River, went all the way up. They had covered a whole bunch of slaves, and they would go all the way to the chain bridge, and then they would get them across over onto Amesbury, where John Greenleaf Whittier would end up taking one of his agents, or he himself would actually take them on from there. So there are well-documented cases for that.
I was wondering if Parsons and Whitfield were ministers at the same time or subsequent? Was Parsons after Whitfield? That's my understanding was that Parsons was also minister at Old South.
Oh, definitely.
And so was that after Whitfield or simultaneous? Were they joint ministers there? That's one question. And then the second question is, was there any contact between Whitfield and Roger Williams, who also was a proponent of the separation of church and state?
I don't have any viable connection between, they ran basically in Presbyterian circles, so there's no noted thing. I mean, Jonathan Edwards preached at the Old South, so he was present during the same time as all this great awakening was occurring, so he was there present, but nothing about the Baptists. Roger Williams down there, that thing there. What was the first one? Oh, yeah.
Parsons and Whitfield.
If you were to walk into the sanctuary, you would see something rather deceptive up on the wall. It says, George Whitfield founded the Old South. He didn't really found it, he inspired it. When he came in, he told them, create your own Presbyterian church. And so they ended up creating that, but he wasn't the actual pastor. Remember, he's an itinerant. He's going up and down the colonies, he's coming from Europe. He crossed the Atlantic 13 times. So he inspired the Old South. Reverend Parsons was recommended by him because Parsons got fired down in Lyme, Connecticut. And so he told him to come up here and be the pastor, and the church accepted him, and he became pastor for the longest time until, of course, 1776.